Now, as we dive into chapters that are found across the Gospels, of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke contain separate accounts of the same events, parallel accounts. And so one of the messages that we're going to focus on today is called the Olivet Discourse. This is a teaching that Jesus gave about the end of the age that is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All separately have their own recordings of this one teaching. Some scholars suggest that Mark was the first gospel written, actually put into written form. But for some of these stories, I'm not necessarily going to go in the order that the book was written, because the orders that the books were written are not necessarily the order that the events happened, the events that they're documenting. Obviously, the events they're documenting took place far before these books were actually put into writing. So all of that aside, we're actually just going to focus in on sort of the timeline of what Jesus shared. So we're going to be kind of jumping around in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but really we're looking at the same events that happened very early on in the very first century of AD, probably around the years, between the years of AD 26 and AD 33. So let's jump in. We're actually going to start with Matthew 24 for no other reason than that it is such a great anchor and sort of place for us to get oriented as we look at, again, parallel accounts of the same message that will also be covered in Mark and in Luke that we're going to look at after this. So I've got Matthew 24 on the screen for you. And just as we do, Matthew, I have to say, I would just want to acknowledge up front that this is a very challenging chapter to interpret with much confidence. Years ago, even in Bible school, I was taught interpretations of Matthew 24 that have since required correction. I did not fully understand this chapter at all at first, and I suspect that no one can fully understand this chapter apart from the Old Testament narrative upon which this chapter is based. And I have heard pastors open Matthew 24 and just start figuring it out without much of a link to the Old Testament narrative that we have spent 31 weeks, 30 weeks up to this point, covering in great detail. So that's actually a very, very important step I have found that has actually given me a lot of clarity about this chapter. And again, much research and just digging into commentaries and all kind of scholarly work about this chapter has very much helped as well, that I'm trying to just condense and synthesize down and simplify greatly into the overview of what we're going to talk about today. Now, one of the reasons that I chose to structure this study chronologically was in hopes of sparing you the confusion that I faced over years of trying to unravel all the various doctrines that arise when we try to approach this chapter without that Old Testament foundation, again, that we've spent the last 30 weeks building. So please, I just want you to take a breath, breathe in, breathe out, and don't feel too discouraged if you find this chapter difficult to grasp or harmonize with at first. If you are like me at all, if you've been taught how to interpret this chapter within a broader doctrine, maybe that's importing a lot of thought into what this chapter says, then I would encourage you to approach this chapter and each of the chapters we're going to look at this week with fresh eyes, just like you're reading it for the first time in light of the Old Testament context that we have been building over these last months. Again, this would be the same context historically into which Jesus stepped himself to give this teaching. At the time Jesus is teaching this, they don't have the book of Revelation. They don't have 1st or 2nd Thessalonians, 1st or 2nd Timothy, 1st or 2nd Corinthians, or many of the other chapters that teachers will often run to try to manage this chapter. That's not available to them at the time. And we're going through this as chronologically as we can, and we're opening up Matthew 24 primarily with the Old Testament context that was all that his disciples would have at the time, and all that Jesus would be referencing to build upon, to build their framework, I should say. So it's helpful, I think, for us today to try to approach it in the same way, not forgetting everything that we've been taught over the prior weeks of this study, because that Old Testament context is very important, just to clarify. But if you have heard pastors teach on Matthew 24, I'm not telling you to just forget all of that or throw it all in the bin, but just for a moment, for the next little bit, just come with a fresh eyes, fresh heart, fresh ears to hear, and just see what we find here today as we explore this together. If we approach Matthew 24 as we've approached all the prior chapters in the Old Testament, just focusing on what would this have meant to the audience, to the author, at the time, not just for us today, it is for us today, but how would they have understood it? How would Matthew, Mark, or Luke themselves, how would the audience that was there have interpreted this or understood it? And would they have had all of the doctrinal baggage that we have built up over hundreds of years of adding our own, little flavorings and seasonings to this? Let all that go for a minute, and let's just go back in time to where they were in history and look at this in context. If we do that, we will find that this chapter all of these chapters maintain very strong continuity with the Old Testament foundation that we've covered so far. It's actually not a lot of new. It's more of a summary of what we've covered so far. Jesus does not show up to try to convince them of new things that they wouldn't have heard before, that wouldn't have been found in the Psalms or the prophets. It's there. He's just consolidating it and providing a little bit of an overview, just a summary, boom, 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 down the list of things that we've covered all of these weeks. So it's not necessarily new, it's just described in a fresh way. And so just for a moment, we're gonna take a stab at it, and if you give it a few tries, you'll find that this becomes quite plain. It doesn't need to be so overcomplicated. And indeed, if you listen to enough people, it is indeed very complicated. Now, I do have to mention that Matthew 24 follows Matthew 23 as a chronological sequence. These things are happening presumably on the same day. It very much seems to be that way. And in Matthew 23, Jesus had pronounced woes on the Pharisees. And it is helpful to go back and take a read through this context because you see the conversation that's been had and what Jesus is highlighting to the Pharisees. You see the lament over Jerusalem, where Jesus provides that awesome little phrase of, "For I tell you," verse 39, "you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord,'" which again, we read about when we covered Psalm 118. So all of that is context is quite important. We don't have time to cover all of it today. In fact, since we covered Psalm 118, you can go back and see what Jesus was talking about in our recording when we covered that chapter. But amazing. I mean, Jesus has just said, "I'm leaving Jerusalem. There's going to be desolation, and you will not see me again until you welcome me, acknowledging my identity as your Messiah." Essentially is what he's saying, which has yet to happen in history. Then, all of the accounts of Luke, Matthew, and Mark contain this same context where as they're leaving the temple in Jerusalem, and they're walking through the Kidron Valley and going up to the Mount of Olives, and they're remarking on the beauty of the temple with all the improvements that Herod has helped make and just the glamour and glory of it. And Jesus says, no, all of these things are going to be destroyed. And as we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll see Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, which did occur historically in 70 AD. Then we get into this conversation where the disciples are asking Jesus on the Mount of Olives, which again, the context for that is very fascinating because the Mount of Olives, Zechariah predicts, is going to be split when Jesus returns, when he comes back for the second time, and he approaches Jerusalem from the east, and he sets his foot on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain splits. And so here they are, just sitting on that mountain. And I just think it's fascinating what might have been all in Jesus's head as he's imagining, forward. He's not remembering to the past. He's actually remembering to the future what this is going to look like. And that's a fascinating concept. But anyway, here it goes. They're asking, tell us what are going to be the signs of these things and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. And that sets a very important context, that it's not just about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but they do want to know about that, but they want to know also about the end of the age and his return, and when all of the messianic promises and all of the new covenant promises culminate and come into maturity and complete fulfillment. And so that's where Jesus just launches in here. Starting in verse 4, Jesus provides a mosaic of conditions that also are predicted in the Old Testament. And the first section, which I think is 4 through 14, or this whole section here, you can mostly see it on your screen there. But starting in verse 4, this section includes conditions or events, circumstances that are historically evident really from the time of Jesus' resurrection until the end of the age. These are not just limited to the end of the age, which will, of course, be the final day of God's vengeance on the nations. But these are actually present through all the years of history since the time of Jesus. And there's arguments to be made that might culminate in an escalation at the end of the age. You could say that because we see a lot of evidence of this today. And what Jesus has to say in verse 6 really kind of sets the expectation about it, because Jesus warned his disciples not to be alarmed, not to have this alarmist behavior. Because there are these conditions, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines and earthquakes, things that have been historically evident for 2,000 years. That, again, he's saying, don't be alarmist. Don't feel this sense of, dread and terror that all these things are now coming upon us. Jesus is returning now. Because these things are evident throughout history, and the end is not yet. He specifically is like, the end is not yet. When you see these things, it's not yet the end. And so to try to box these into just being evident at the end of the age is a little bit silly, because it kind of contradicts what seems like the sense that Jesus is giving them. And in the midst of this explanation in verse 8, Jesus says these are just the beginnings of birth pains. And the birth pains are not even necessarily the labors. I mean, for those of you who have been married, or if you've been pregnant, which is not me, but I have been married to a pregnant person, and I have seen how birth pains are evident through the pregnancy. I mean, it's not just the labor, the contractions proper, but there's pain associated with the process of growing a baby and that whole pregnancy process. There's a constant reminder. There are aches, there are changes that are a constant reminder that there is a delivery approaching, that there are contractions approaching, but they're evident throughout the whole process. And so we see that it really characterized as, the birth pains and these events that are historically evident, including being delivered up to tribulation, not the final tribulation, but being delivered up to, another word for that could be affliction, being persecuted, being martyred, being hated by all nations. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. And so we have these conditions of persecution, martyrdom, reproach, betrayal, deception, apostasy. These things have been described in the Old Testament as well as characterizing the rebellion. That rebellion period has so much carelessness and such an error of lack of accountability. This just environment where everybody feels like they can get away with anything. Isaiah 59 talks about how truth and justice stand far off, that justice is not upheld in the public square. And it's just it is a massive rebellion against the Lord in this period of lawlessness, or at least you could say irreverence for God's covenant, especially at the end of the age, but of course evident throughout history as well. Now, along that process, all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are going to talk about how the gospel is proclaimed throughout the whole world. Not necessarily that the gospel is accepted throughout the whole world before Jesus' return, but the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. And in fact, many of these birth pain conditions will function to facilitate the proclamation of the gospel to all the world before what would be the very end. The end will come, meaning the Lord's day of vengeance, the proper return of Jesus, and that final day when that final day when it is the final day of accountability. So there, we have these birth pain conditions, and I have some cross-references for those in the notes, for those of you who are interested, but I'm going to move on to verse 15. Then, again, we have these vague conditions up here, first section. See that you're not alarmed, because the end is not yet. So this is all, the end is not yet sort of timing as the gospel is being proclaimed, which is great. But then a proper sign of the end, a proper sign that the end is now yet. The end is now. And the proper contractions are starting. If we continue with that pregnancy metaphor, this is where the contractions are really kicking in, and the clear sign is the abomination of desolation, which I've highlighted on the screen in red for you. If you're following along in the video, Jesus begins to describe in verse 15 some of the unique conditions of the end of the age. And so again, the heavy contractions that are involved in the birth process. This abomination of desolation. Now, Jesus explicitly references Daniel's prophecy recorded in Daniel 11. That is where this term, abomination of desolation, comes from. And in fact, of course, Jesus cites it. He says, spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So, okay, at that point, we do have to pause when we talk about Daniel. Now, I don't have time to cover all of Daniel and this prophecy here in this video, but thankfully, we did that. We've actually covered it before. There's a pretty good set of notes on that and the recording available for you on the website and the app, so we're not going to get into all of it today. But this does help us sort of have a moment to remember the context, where specifically, the Antichrist will speak boastful words. He will attribute divinity to himself and begin to demand allegiance and worship, even in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes did serve as an interim fulfillment and a historical foreshadowing of this prophecy, but he didn't fully match the prediction. Antiochus Epiphanes never claimed deity. He didn't claim to be God. He didn't claim to be greater than the God of Israel. He set up an altar to Zeus, not to himself. Now, of course, and he doesn't fit quite the time frame that Daniel lays out as the final ultimate fulfillment. It's different because it's an interim historical foreshadowing that we find in Antiochus Epiphanes and his story. And Jesus is treating this prophecy here in Matthew 24 as a yet future prophecy that has a final fulfillment at the end of the age. Now, as we get into what follows, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Of course, it's a time of great trouble. This is really a time when God's wrath and discipline are poured out on the people and the nation of Israel. And so to summarize that kind of Old Testament narrative for a moment, which we can find in places like Isaiah 24, Daniel 11 and 12, Ezekiel 38 and 39, Zechariah 12 through 14, Psalm 2, Psalm 83. I mean, we've been covering this, Habakkuk, however you want to look at it. Many of these chapters we've covered before, just to give you just a 2-minute summary. The Antichrist defilement of Jerusalem's temple will constitute a betrayal of a Middle East peace treaty that was confirmed 3.5 years-ish earlier. At that time, the Antichrist will seize the economic and military power that was consolidated in the treaty and launch a genocidal campaign against anyone loyal to God's covenants and to God's Messiah. The Antichrist will successfully seize half of Jerusalem, but he will be defeated by Israel's Messiah before the city completely falls. These prophecies remain categorically unfulfilled by the events of 70 AD or any subsequent event. Again, that's all narrative that we can get out of the Old Testament. This is not even taken out of Matthew 24 yet. This is all expectations that have been previously set by the Psalms and the prophets. Again, we've covered them in great detail, so we have receipts for those. And many of those cross-references, at least a little snippet of them, are available for you in the notes, so you can look at those. Now, naturally, with that context, understanding the terror that's going to take place, the abomination of desolation, Jesus would warn anyone in Israel to flee the moment the Middle East peace treaty is broken by the Antichrist. Remarkably, Jesus implies that our prayers can influence the timing of the Antichrist's betrayal to the day. So we don't actually know the specific day or hour when the abomination of desolation is going to take place. That's interesting. That's very interesting, actually. And so let's look at this. Then let those who are in Judea flee. Don't go, if you're on the housetop, don't go down and take what's out of the house. Let no one who's in the field turn back to get his cloak. For alas, for women who are pregnant and nursing infants in those days, imagine having to flee the nation suddenly because of the aggression of the Antichrist, again, which will be to slaughter and take captive every Jew. I mean, it is egregious, and again, a time of turmoil. We'll let Jesus explain it in a second, but let's not skip verse 20. So pray that your flight might not be in winter, what? Or on the Sabbath, down to the season and the day, which obviously implies that the day is not set in stone. Jesus wouldn't even know the day or the hour, because the day or the hour can be influenced by the prayers of the saints. That's remarkable. Just, tuck that away, because we might come back to that a little bit later. Now, interestingly, if you think about this practically, when it comes to the Antichrist suddenly interrupting that rebellious period, where there's rebellion, there's carelessness, there's sin, there's, of course, a false peace. It's a restless peace, but it is a lot of commercial prosperity, a lot of drunkenness, and all of that selfish ambition, just being given full, carte blanche in the human capacity for sinfulness. In that rebellion, the Antichrist suddenly interrupts that, abruptly stops it by setting up this abomination of desolation, breaking the peace treaty, and launching a literal aggressive assault on Israel and the Jewish people, and not just Israel and the Jews, but believers in Jesus, the Messiah, and in other nations as well that are talked about in Daniel and later when we get to the book of Revelation. But even from Daniel, we know that the Antichrist acts against Egypt and other places. Not every nation will just automatically accept what the Antichrist has done. And so the Antichrist will, in a lot of cases, bribe and flatter people into, giving them, making deals where he's giving them, seats of influence and sorts of power for their allegiance. But there's going to be some places where he's got to deal with them by force, other than Israel. And again, Daniel talks about those. It's super fascinating. But we've already covered that, so we got to move on. So here's what Jesus goes on to say. For then, after the abomination of desolation, there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and will never again be, again. Again, Jesus is describing the severity of the final tribulation, of God's discipline before Israel's final deliverance. Jesus adds that the endless ambition of the Antichrist would eventually destroy humanity. The Old Testament has substantiated this. Isaiah saw this in Isaiah 10. But his ambition will be cut short by the Lord's day of vengeance and the release of the Messiah, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. If those days had not been cut short, no human would be saved. Not because of God's wrath, but because of the Antichrist's ambition. His ambition would destroy the human race. And again, Isaiah chapter 10 says, the Antichrist is not so the Lord gives the Antichrist actually a task. There is a purpose in what the Antichrist does, but again, the Antichrist does not limit himself to the purpose that the Lord intends. Isaiah chapter 10 verse 7 says, he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think, according to the limits and boundaries of what God would use him for. But it's in his heart, in the heart of the Antichrist, to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. It just becomes this sort of unfolding domino effect of destruction that's in the ambition of the Antichrist. And there are other cross-references from the Old Testament about how this will be a tribulation unlike any other time in history, past, present, or future. And so that's substantiated several places. Jeremiah 30, Joel chapter 2, other places too in the Old Testament that talk about this is unlike anything else in history. Nothing will have happened like it before, and nothing will ever happen like it again. And that's a key timing indicator that we're not just talking about 70 AD, but we're not even just talking about World War II. We're talking about something yet future that, again, is dreadful, but it ends with a permanent final restoration, because there's something to be said about, a time of tribulation, unlike anything that will ever be again, has a hint of promise in it, that this is going to be stopped and it will never happen again. Why? Because the Messiah comes and Messianic age and, yay, things we've talked about before. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, who are the elect? Now, based on the Old Testament narrative, well, we could definitely identify the elect as the Jewish race, God's chosen race. And again, there are passages that we've looked at where God really singles out Israel as his agent of redemption, as his chosen people, his cherished possession among the nations. The Old Testament has well substantiated that God cannot allow the Jews to be destroyed, or he would violate his covenant, and it would just be a massive problem. He would violate things he has sworn on himself. So he'd violate himself if the nation of Israel and the Jews were, completely wiped from history. This interpretation is an accurate interpretation, but Jesus' words in Matthew 24 are not limited to the Jewish race. There's more than just that in the elect. Matthew records Jesus using the Greek word for elect and chosen to represent those of any race who remain loyal to him. Matthew 22:14 is an example. I've got that one in the notes for you. The elect are a global, that is, multi-ethnic population of saints. Those who are loyal to Israel's Messiah and who are loyal to Jesus, who do face extinction at the hand of the Antichrist. But for their sake, the Antichrist ambition is cut short. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, there he is, don't believe him, again, because there's false Christ, and they're thinking that somehow there's going to be a discrete or somehow limited return, a secret return or second appearing of the Messiah. He says, no, I'm not going to return to a secret audience in some kind of discreet way. No, instead, the display of Jesus' return will be universally visible and evident, likened to lightning in the sky. Not saying that it happens in a flash, but that it happens in such a display that it's universally recognizable. It's not something that's going to be easily missed. It's nothing secretive or discreet about it. And in fact, that's what this little phrase, which we don't find really in modern conversation, but this little, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. It just means instinctively it's going to be openly recognizable in the same way that vultures can recognize a corpse and be drawn to it. It's just self-evident, out there for anybody to recognize. Isaiah 40 verse 5 says, the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. In Habakkuk 3, Habakkuk says his splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, and his brightness was like the light with rays flashing from his hands. And even then, his power was veiled. And he goes on to talk about the events of the Messiah's second appearing, or Jesus' return. Now, interestingly, these false prophets, he says, will perform great signs and wonders. These false prophets will be reinforced by real signs and wonders. It will be like the battle between Moses and Pharaoh's magicians will replay as true and false prophets perform miraculous signs, both of them. Audiences are going to have to discern the integrity of the message by their knowledge and loyalty to truth, rather than by the appearance of signs. Obviously, many will gladly abandon truth to chase signs, which we find self-evident in even today's culture. So Jesus' reference to the elect, it reinforces the interpretation that he's referring to any race of saints that are loyal to Jesus. If we were to interpret the elect just as the Jewish race, well, it'd be contradictory because the Old Testament predicts rampant deception and rebellion among the Jews at the end of the age. Imagine Jesus predicting Jewish deception and then warning that there would be deception that would even possibly ensnare the Jews. No, he's already said for sure they're going to be deceived. By implication, therefore, the saints are susceptible to this end time deception. It says, if possible, even the elect. But I've told you beforehand, he's trying to give us a heads up. It's actually important that we study this now so that we're prepared for when it happens then. Now, as we get down to verse 29, Jesus describes his second appearing. It's the day of the Lord's vengeance to deliver Israel and defeat the Antichrist. And there's language here immediately after the tribulation of those days, after the Antichrist abomination of desolation and his genocidal campaign against Israel, and wrathful judgments that are beginning to be poured out against the earth and the Antichrist campaign, which we'll talk about later. But after the tribulation of those days, The sun will be darkened. The moon will not give off its light. The stars will fall from heaven. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Why? Because of the appearing of the Son of Man. There will appear in the sky the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory. And he will send out his angels. Well, we'll come back to that in a moment. Before we get to verse 31, that language so far has all been evident across the Old Testament prophets. And so I've actually have many of those cross references for you in the notes. Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, Isaiah 13, Isaiah 34, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 63, Nahum 1, Zephaniah 1, Habakkuk 3, Ezekiel 34, Joel 3. They're all here. And again, so this is just a summary, not of new information, but of information that has already been prophesied about the Messiah's second appearing specifically. Jesus describes his second appearing in the sky, which also fits that prior lightning metaphor from earlier in the chapter. The specific reference to the sign of the Son of Man, there's not necessarily an Old Testament reference to the sign, quote unquote, of the Son of Man, although it is thought to refer to Jesus asserting his global authority that is mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. We'll come back to that maybe later. Old Testament prophets often spoke of the final rebellion and tribulation as a period of delayed accountability. And the second appearing of the Messiah would be the day of ultimate accountability and the enforcement of the Messiah's rule on earth in a very tangible, literal kingdom. And Jesus also describes, when he says, all the tribes of the earth will mourn, he describes the recognition of his identity, not just as Israel's Messiah, but as Israel's rejected Messiah. Jewish and Gentile people who refused to accept Jesus as Israel's Messiah will be confronted with the undeniable truth of his identity. This is also well substantiated in the Old Testament, Isaiah 49, Zechariah 12, almost quoting Zechariah 12 word for word, almost. You could argue some parts of Jeremiah 30 to 32 might fit that as well. Jeremiah talks about them weeping, but it sounds like they're weeping over their sin and as they're recognizing the extent of their rebellion. But simultaneously, they're recognizing the identity of the Son of Man. He is Jesus. It is Jesus. And that's exactly what he's describing here. Now, we get to this point of verse 33, and at that time, as Jesus is descending after the Antichrist and after all of this, the day of the Lord's vengeance to punish the nations, to set the captives free, all of that great stuff, this is when, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, all across the horizon. And so interestingly, one end of the sky to the other too is another great way to phrase that. But at this point, we're talking again about the elect. This is not just Jewish survivors. This is Gentiles who are followers of the Messiah. This is Jews who are followers of the Messiah. Jesus describes this supernatural gathering in the sky of the elect as saints who have survived the tyranny of the Antichrist during the tribulation. Jesus does not provide a lot of detail about the means other than from one end of the sky to the other. But he's just kind of giving this quick little boom. He says it in one sentence, not a whole big teaching about it yet. But he does say they will be supernaturally gathered when he appears to defeat the Antichrist and when the nations openly recognize his identity, which is after the tribulation. So interesting. This is what is often summarized and referred to as the rapture of the saints, as the saints are collected in the sky with the Messiah at his coming. It's fascinating to see this. So, lessons of the fig tree. Let's just move on because we will come back to some more context for that in other chapters, especially in later weeks. There are going to be some more commentaries about this that will give a lot more detail, I suppose you could say, than what Jesus provides here in the text. That's all we got, that one sentence right here in Matthew 24. So let's move on. From the fig tree. Here, the lessons from the fig tree. So awesome. Jesus uses the metaphor of the fig tree and natural seasons to explain how the elect can recognize the approach of the end of the age by paying attention to the aforementioned signs and current events. I'm not going to go into this very much, except for I'm not going to dodge verse 34. Take a sip of coffee on verse 34. Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, interestingly, in Luke 17, Jesus says, none of you are going to live your natural life to see the coming of the Son of Man. So how do you square that with Luke 17, where he says, no, you're not going to survive that long. You're going to have to wait. You're going to long for it, but you won't see it. They will see it in their, afterlife, but not in their natural life. And so here we have this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And obviously there's a lot of debate about this verse. The Greek word used for generation can refer to either a period of time, like a people of a time, or a people of a kind or lineage. The generation of Abraham could have been when Abraham lived or his lineage that descends after him. Both uses of this word occur in Matthew's gospel. Notably, the use of generation to refer to lineage is not always in reference to just a racial or ethnic lineage, but also to a spiritual or prophetic lineage. Therefore, some scholars explain that this verse refers to a spiritual lineage of the elect. This is reinforced by Jesus' final woe to the scribes and Pharisees immediately before this conversation in Matthew 23. Let me just scroll up. Bear with me. There it is. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, if you were to open up and read this final woe, you'll find that Jesus is accusing the Pharisees of being descendants of those who killed the prophets. You are of the generation of those who killed Abel and who killed Zechariah, who killed the prophets. It's a wicked and perverse lineage of his people, a spiritual lineage. He says, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon. Really, it's this lineage, the lineage of all those who killed the prophets. They are walking in that same lineage and under the same curse of God's wrath. And all those 7 woes are summarized in that way. And certainly, all of the curses of that lineage, have not fully come to pass yet, because they also come to pass in fullness when the Messiah returns, and there's, resurrection of death as well. But down here to Matthew 24:34. Many scholars have no problem interpreting Matthew 24:34 as referring to a spiritual lineage of the elect, given how recently Jesus used the word in a similar manner when talking to the Pharisees. Alternatively, some scholars insist that this verse refers to a time period. It must be this living generation in this period of time that would experience an interim fulfillment and historical foreshadowing of the conditions described before the abomination of desolation, as well as, you could argue, a partial fulfillment of the Antichrist siege of Jerusalem. Obviously, Rome comes in 70 AD, destroys Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is not rescued. There is no appearing of the Son of Man to save Jerusalem from Rome, but there will be to save Jerusalem from the Antichrist. There's no historical record of a Roman equivalent of the abomination of desolation in the same manner of the Antichrist. And nor did Rome initiate a genocidal campaign against all Jews. Obviously, there's Jewish survivors to this day. And nor did Jesus physically intervene to prevent Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. So categorically, you would have to say it's an interim fulfillment of the birth pains and some of the labor contractions, but certainly not the final fulfillment. But because we can have this understanding of an interim fulfillment and then a ultimate fulfillment at the end of the age, some commentators will address this passage that way. This interpretation, I think, would be acceptable if it's not made redundant by the interpretation of a generation as a lineage, which I think is a little bit more favorable. Finally, there are some scholars that insist that this verse refers to the total fulfillment of everything in Matthew 24 within the timing of one generation. Usually they say around the events of 70 AD. This explanation, their justifications and explanations for how to match up what Jesus describes with everything that happened in the first century are very vague, and they tolerate a lot more inference and symbolism and kind of hand-waving. Tolerates a lot more ambiguity than the other interpretations do. It seems a lot more straightforward to interpret it either of the other two ways. So I'll leave it with you to decide between that. But then we get down to no one knows the day or the hour. Jesus advances the disciples' question to the finest detail of the day and the hour of the events surrounding his return. The day or the hour. Now, interestingly, Jesus has already mentioned that there is an uncertain day, and the uncertain day is the abomination of desolation. And if you were to compare this with the way Jesus describes this teaching, or if you were to compare this with Luke's record of this type of teaching from Jesus in Luke 17, it seems a little bit more consistent that the day or the hour he might be referring to is the abomination of desolation, in the launch of the labor pains that embody the broader context of the coming of the Son of Man, using the terminology of the coming of the Son of Man broadly to be that labor that's going to afflict that entire generation. You don't have to interpret it that way. When we come to Luke 17, which we will in a moment, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, because if you were to compare this, open up Luke 17 and just look at it side by side, that seems to be how Luke interprets it. But we'll worry about that later. Anyway, here, in the remainder of the chapter, Jesus encourages his disciples to be watchful, encourages us to be watchful as the signs unfold, and to resolve to endure to the end, even along the delay. As we get down to, as in the days of Noah, Jesus describes the differences between those who are watchful and those who are careless, and those who participate in the rebellion, those who are not really paying attention to the signs or being loyal to God's covenant or to his Messiah. These are signs of the approaching season, though they may not be able to isolate down the specific day. Of course, the careless will be caught by surprise. Some will be swept away in God's wrath, while others will survive. Scholars often liken these verses to like the Passover judgment in Egypt. Now, some scholars suggest that the taken, where are they down here? The people who are taken, two men are in a field, one is taken, another one is left, might refer to the rapture. It could, when the Son of Man appears, or it could refer to those struck by God's wrath. It could refer to those struck by the wrath of the Antichrist. And given that sort of context of talking about the judgment flood of Noah, which of course would be a negative taken. Again, Luke 17 also talks about those who are taken, and it sounds like those who are taken are being taken or killed by the Antichrist, or if nothing else, by God's wrath. But again, we'll come look at that later. Again, I say there's scholars on both sides. You could say it's the rapture, or you could not. It doesn't really change what Jesus has described previously, so we can move on. Then he says, stay awake, for you don't know when the day of your Lord is coming, which I would argue you could interpret as the broader events of the day of the Lord, beginning with the launch of the labor contractions, not just limited to the conclusion of the labor contractions. And then Jesus likens the events of the end of the age to an estate under the care of the master's servants. The watchful servant anticipates the end of the age, and he will be rewarded in the Messianic age. And the careless servant misinterprets the delayed accountability. Specifically, the wicked servant sees that there's little accountability, and he just participates in the rebellious activities. The careless servant will be punished in God's wrath at the end of the age. And that is where Matthew 24 ends. And we're also going to look at parallel accounts in Mark 13 and Luke 17 and Luke 21. But before we jump to those, Matthew 25 is part of the same continuing message as recorded in the book of Matthew. And so we're going to look at Matthew 25 first, and then come back to Mark 13 and Luke 21 and Luke 17.